All right, let's begin. Oh, the Renaissance. Welcome to the English Renaissance. What does Renaissance mean? What language? French, Renaissance. And Renaissance was a rebirth of knowledge. Does anyone know how that started? Remember from world history how that rebirth started.
Black Plague.
Well, that didn't start the Renaissance. that made...
The split, the schism.
No? What brought knowledge back?
People make art.
Okay. Do you remember the rich dudes' names?
Medici.
The Medici, that's right, the Medici. In the South, the Renaissance was started by the Medici family. I shouldn't say started, but they had a lot to do with it. The Medici boys went all over Europe breaking into churches, not to steal their gold and silver, but to steal the artifacts and books and knowledge, and they brought it back to Italy. And they were really responsible by being patrons of the arts for the rebirth of art. They sponsored people and science. They sponsored people like Galileo, Michelangelo, Botticelli. Lots of interesting people were able to do their art because the Medicis paid for it. So this is an exciting time because the Black Death had left Europe depressed and desolate. You can imagine if a third of the people you knew died in a gruesome death, the spirit that would be over you. How many of you have lost someone close to you? I mean really close, like a family member. Do you remember the heaviness you felt, especially the few days after you found out? Imagine being like that for several years and everyone you love just dying. It was terrible and they were really down. It's called the Dark Ages, even though there were some great accomplishments. There were great cathedrals built and they started to educate. But the sciences were really hurt. They didn't do much in science during the Middle Ages. So along comes the Renaissance. What we're looking at particularly is how the Renaissance affected England. And one of the names, Renaissance names that you all know is a famous playwright named William Shakespeare. Okay, here we're talking about, they're dating the Renaissance from about 1485 to 1625. You can go online and everyone will have different dates, but that's what your book has chosen. So it blossomed first in the Italian states, as we said, and it moved northward, but northward the Renaissance was really inspired by a much different spirit. What was that spirit? Religion, exactly. Martin Luther was part of that Reformation, and they were much more conservative. While Botticelli was drawing beautiful, slender maidens in a mythology painting, what were they painting in the north?
Christ.
Yes, Bible scenes, stuff like that. So, so they, right to the point there. So they, it was a whole different spirit then than now. So one of the things that was interesting, it says here in your book, during the Renaissance, scholars reacted against what they saw as the Dark Ages of medieval Europe, and they revived the learning of ancient Greece and Rome, and they wanted a rebirth of civilization. So the classics from Greece and Rome were the things that the Medicis were trying to collect, and that was their inspiration. So the thirst for knowledge just burst open, especially in science. We now had science beginning to blossom, and there were advances in astronomy. The compass was invented, and then we had the age of exploration. Do you remember from your sophomore year, we talked about how if you could see the globe from outer space around this time period, around 1500, it would look like someone stepped on an anthill and all these little black ants were coming out on the water. And that was the global era, the beginning of the global era. And you learned about some great people who were brave enough to do some of these first journeys. Sailing was incredibly dangerous. So in the boats, storms in the middle of the ocean could get quite violent, and ships could sink readily in those kinds of conditions. And then going around the Cape, that was dangerous too. So who were some of the names? Do you remember any name of those great explorer sailors? Even one? Magellan, that's good. He was famous because his team was the first to circumnavigate the globe and prove what? The earth was round. We heard it in theory, but he was the first one that he didn't quite make it to the end himself, but his crew did, and they proved that the world was round. John Cabot is mentioned in your reading here. He sailed for the English and reached Canada. So that was the English connection to it. We also had Diaz and da Gama and Balboa and all those names that you, as I'm saying them, your brain is going, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah, I remember those guys. Okay, what about what was happening in religion? Well, they were questioning the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, and there was a new edition of the New Testament by Erasmus. Now, Erasmus is one of my favorite scholars from this time period, and he raised serious questions about the standard interpretations of the Bible. Because of his friendship with people like Thomas More from England, Erasmus focused attention on the issues of morality and religion. Now, Erasmus, strangely enough, he was a humanist in many ways, and strangely enough, even though he was an inspiration in England for a break from the Catholic Church, he remained Roman Catholic. But the church split because of the influence of whom? Martin Luther really inspired the Reformation. Does anybody remember the date that he put his list? No, I don't think so. Is that it?
No, because a couple weeks ago was like the 500th anniversary.
It was in October. Yeah, it was October.
Well, there's been lots of Octobers since Martin Luther was born. The year, you know, I was thinking it was it 1493? 53, that early. Okay, well, the church, it says here, he helped pave the way for a split in the church that began in 1517. I thought he did it in 1519, but if this was 1517, I am wrong. So we can find that out easily enough. Just get out your phone and share with us, somebody. Tell us when the date was.
October 31, 1517.
1517. Okay, I thought it was 1519. All right, 1517. He protested. What inspired Martin Luther to protest against the church? What inspired him? What was he doing when he got this, when he had this aha experience where he went, I don't have to do this? Does anybody remember what he was doing? I'm sure you've seen movies and heard it. You want to try it, John?
Climbing the stairs.
Yes. And how was he climbing the stairs?
Praying.
Yes. And what posture was he in? On his knees. Yeah. Can you imagine? Your knees, oh my goodness. So they did things like that that were painful, would make them bleed to pay penance. And he's doing this and he's thinking about the words in Scripture, and it's like this light bulb comes on. Christ died for my sins. I don't have to go on the cross again. You know, he thought, Christ died for my sins. I don't need to punish myself any further. I am free. I just need to claim the freedom in Christ. And so he had this great experience, and then he started thinking about the Scripture more and more, and he said, you can't buy forgiveness of sin. What is that all about? What was he thinking of then? What was the church doing? They were selling indulgences. So some people even bought them ahead of time. You know, I'd like to have an indulgence to sleep with my neighbor's wife. And you know, they'd buy their forgiveness ahead of time, where they'd say they'd do whatever they want, and if they were rich, they could sin even more because they would just go and buy forgiveness. Is there anything that you know of in the Holy Bible, those of you who are familiar with it, that would justify that? No. I can't find anything. And so that he saw that, and he said, no, that's not right either. It's just a way for the church to make money. And then there was a lot of corruption among the popes that wasn't very good either, because at the time, popes were allowed to buy, and cardinals were allowed to buy their position in the church. Big mistake. That's not the way it is today. The Catholic Church has gone through a lot of reform itself, and now their cardinals and their pope have to be chosen on merit, but it wasn't so back then. So anyway, along come the Tudors. The famous Tudor, Henry VIII, opened a new era in English life. Now, Henry VIII was incredibly controlling, and he didn't like anyone telling him what to do. And he had that happen from Thomas More. He was not happy about that. The first Tudor monarch, by the way, was Henry VII, and he inherited an England that had been torn apart by the War of Roses, and things were kind of a mess. And by the time he died, he had rebuilt the nation's treasury, so he did some things worth mentioning too. But then he was succeeded by his handsome, athletic son, Henry VIII. Now, when I see pictures and paintings of Henry VIII, I do not think of him as handsome. And the reason is that he ate so much. He suffered from gout all the time. He gained weight. His face got pudgy. But apparently, when he was young, he was a very handsome young man. He had red hair. He was very athletic and energetic. And he wanted the Pope to name him as the Holy Roman Emperor. Remember how that was just a title that didn't really, it was an honorable title, and the Pope gave it to someone else. So to appease Henry, the Pope gave him the title. It's right here in your book, Defender of the Faith. So he was Defender of the Faith. But his good relationship wouldn't last long, because when the Pope refused him to remarry, to be able to remarry, he just got rid of the religion. He said, if this religion won't let me remarry, I'll make my own religion. Thus, the Church of England. Henry married 6 times altogether. His first 2 marriages produced 2 daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, and his 3rd wife had a son, Edward. Edward was not a very robust child. Apparently, he was a very sweet and kind person, but he wasn't strong, and he died at a very young age. He became king for a short time before he died. Mary was the daughter of his first wife that he rejected for no reason except that he had the hots for someone else, Catherine of Aragon. So she was from Spain, and the Spanish got really angry about that, but he sent her packing home, and he married the next woman, who was the mother of Elizabeth I. Does anyone know who that is? No girls here read the Philippa Gregory novels? I'm surprised. Most of my girls used to really know this stuff. It was Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn. You've heard of her, right? You've heard of Anne Boleyn? She got her head chopped off because Henry didn't think she was being faithful. Whether she was or wasn't really, I don't really know, but anyway, he had her head cut off. He got mad at her, but her daughter Elizabeth lived, and she lived to be one of the greatest monarchs in English history. It was during the almost 50 years of her reign, before she died in 1603, that she really led what was called the Golden Age of England. Shakespeare was writing plays, Ben Jonson, Andrew Marvell, all these great people were working. She was smart enough not to get married. She was called the Virgin King, which is a big joke, but anyway. She wore white makeup on her face, and she styled herself the Virgin King. And you can imagine how many people tried to marry this woman because she was the Queen of England and they would be the king. But she didn't trust men not to be controlling, and she wanted to run the country her way, so she very intelligently never married. It could have been a lot different if she had, but she had her favorites off and on. One of them was Sir Walter Raleigh, who we'll learn about. You know about Sir Walter Raleigh from history. Does anybody remember what he did in history? He was one of the sailing adventurers, and he founded that colony that was called Roanoke. He also brought the potato back. I'm pretty sure it was him who brought the potato to Europe. But anyway, William, he was a sailor and an adventurer, but she took an interest in him, and then when she was through with him, she went on to the next man, and he married one of her ladies in the court, and she was so angry she had him put in prison. I guess once you were one of her favorites, you were supposed to stay available forever. I don't know. She was an interesting woman. Okay, so the religious turmoil begins, and King Edward took the throne, but he died at age 15, like I said, very young. And then Mary took the throne because she was next in line, and she wanted to marry the Catholic king. Mary was Catholic, and she wanted to marry the Catholic king of Spain. His name was Philip, and she was his 4th wife, I believe. But anyway, Mary died. She had some, we don't know exactly what was wrong with her, but she died, and Elizabeth was next in line. Now, it was bad because when Mary was on the throne, she started persecuting Protestants and tried to make England Catholic again, and that was a big, big mess. That's how she got the nickname Bloody Mary, which is now the name of a famous alcoholic beverage. But I think a Bloody Mary is vodka and tomato juice or something like that. So, named in her honor. Named in her honor. But Mary died after only 5 years, even though she took a lot of lives in that time. And Elizabeth put an end to the religious turmoil. She made the Church of England have some aspects of the Catholic religion, some of the Protestant religion. She kept the high service type service that the Catholics had, but she changed a lot of things that she and her counselors did not think was right. So the Church of England became the church, was a smart thing to do. Now it didn't matter. You were Church of England. You weren't Catholic or Protestant. So she ended that. Okay, if you look on page 226 in your book, 226. I hope you're paying attention to the things I'm pointing out, because those are the things that you'll be quizzed on. So I hope you're paying attention. So after Bloody Mary died, Elizabeth had another outstanding problem, and it was her Catholic cousin, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. And she was by birth next in line for the throne of England. Because the Catholics did not recognize Henry VIII's marriage to Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, they considered Mary Stuart the Queen of England. Imprisoned by Elizabeth for 18 years, Mary instigated numerous plots against Elizabeth. And following the recommendations of her advisor, Elizabeth stepped up punishment of the Catholics but let her royal cousin live. Finally, Parliament insisted on Mary's execution, and she was beheaded in 1587 for constantly making plots against the Queen. So that was her Catholic threat against the Church of England. If you look on 226 now, you can see how comfortably they dressed back there. Look at that woman. Page 256. I can tell if you're on it by the pictures I see out. Okay. Listen to this. Noble women look like dolls on display, tightly laced into dresses that resembled giant bells. I love this description. Noblemen were arrayed like showy peacocks in close-fitting jackets and wide collars that seemed to serve up their heads on a platter of lace. High fashion was indeed a statement during Elizabeth's reign, as shown by the pictures on this page. That's Queen Elizabeth and Sir Walter Raleigh, who in this picture looks to me like he's got curlers in his hair. I guess they just put lace or something in there. Clothing was elaborate and theatrical in an age that loved drama. Two devices that helped create these effects were the ruff, and that's what you call the thing you see around Sir Walter Raleigh's. How would you guys like to wear one of those every day? Look at that puppy. I mean, it takes up your whole neck. You'd have to be, how would you look down? And boy, you know what? Mine would probably be covered with food because he had to eat over that thing. So that was crazy. The ruff and the farthingale, both which came from the Spanish court. And the farthingale, I'm pretty sure, is that wire thing that comes out to the side on women to hold their dresses out like this. So, all right, but you can see from the picture of Raleigh above, it could be expanded to the size of a very large platter. The farthingale was a linen underskirt stretched over thick iron wire that supported a skirt or dress, and that's what gave it its bell-like shape. Toward the end of Elizabeth's reign, fashions became a little less showy, and men began to wear falling collars more like that of today and simpler doublet or close-fitting jacket. Women changed their bell-shaped gowns to drum-shaped ones, and in the early 17th century, the farthingale itself was replaced by padding. And in that time, they had, you put this thing around your waist and it had big pads on either side, but I'm sure it was more comfortable than wearing iron. Do you know iron is heavy? And then how would you sit down? Crazy, huh? Okay, so that takes us to page 226. Now, you have a quiz on this tomorrow, and if I see correctly, it also includes page 232. Everything we covered, oh no, we didn't cover page 227. We have to cover page 227. The Stuarts and the Puritans. Okay, Elizabeth died in, does anyone know? I said it once today. 16 what? 03, yay. 1603, she died, and she was the end of the Tudor line. She never got married, so she had no, what?
Heir.
She had no heir. So she died in 1603, and according to all the complicated rules of monarchy, the next people in line for the throne were from the Stuart house, the House of Stuart. James Stuart came next, James the First. He was the one responsible for, it was during his reign that they wrote the King James Bible. That's why it's called King James, from James the First. And the Stuarts took over the throne. Elizabeth had named King James VI of Scotland as her successor, making him James I of England. So she had something to do with that, and he claimed the throne. James was a Protestant, and that's what I think she was concerned about. The years of James I's reign are sometimes described as the Jacobean, from Jacobin, the Latin word for James. His predecessor, like his predecessor, James I was a strong supporter of the arts. So James did okay. And when he died, Charles I took the throne. And poor Charles I, you remember what happened to him? Now, first of all, I showed some of you a painting. He was a short little dude. So he had high-heeled boots and a hat to make him look taller. And he had a beautiful horse, but the horse's head is down, so he can kind of look shorter than the king. And then he's standing up on a higher ridge and his servant is standing down lower. So the painting was really concocted to make this guy look tall. But he was a little guy and he always had this long curly wig on. And I can't judge his reign. I don't think it was bad, but he was unfortunate enough to be the king when the when the Puritans decided they wanted to rule England. And they did for a while, and it was called the Commonwealth. How many of you remember learning about that? I'm so glad. Okay, so we had the Commonwealth, but what happened to Charles I? What did the Puritans do to him? They killed him. Do you remember how? Anyone remember how Charles I died? I mean, it's been 2 years since you learned this, but yes, he did. He got his head chopped off. He is the only English monarch ever to be executed. Charles I. Poor Charles I. His son, Charles II, or the guy who would have been next in line, headed for the hills. I mean, I would have too. He left England and he took refuge in another country. Do you remember me saying that after England got tired of the Protestant rule, they kicked him out and they wanted their king, Charles II? They wanted him to come back. And do you remember me telling you that he was a little nervous about coming back? Yeah, no kidding. You cut my dad's head off and now you want me to be next in line to have my head cut off? That would be a little frightening. But he did come back, and he was a very amiable, friendly sort of person. Everybody liked him. His reign went fine. And then he finally was followed by the next person in line, who was a James. So if you remember correctly, it was like a mirror. With the water being the Puritan thing, it was James I, Charles I, and then down here it was reversed, Charles II, James II, and in the middle was the Puritan rule. Do you remember learning that? Actually, every one of you recited to me all the English monarchs out loud from Queen Elizabeth all the way to George IV. Do you remember doing that? Yeah, it didn't stick very well, did it? But you know what? This is another reminder. At least you've heard the names. All right, so James I also persecuted the Puritans, who were strongly represented in the House of Commons, so that didn't go over well, and he had the King James Bible done. Now, if you look at this picture of Henry on page 227, that's how I picture Henry VIII. Isn't he handsome? How many think that man is handsome? Girls, would you go for this hunk of a guy? I don't think so. See what I mean about his face becoming bloated? He's overweight. He doesn't look too great in this picture. But the painting itself is a great one. It's by Hans Holbein. And if anyone here has taken art history from me, you know about him. He was the court painter for Henry VIII, and he did some beautiful work. Okay, now let's go to page 232. And if we don't get this page covered, that's okay, because you get to read it at home. Your quiz is going to be on what we just covered. Should I just review that? Because page 232 is funny, so it's fun to read and it's short. So let's go back to page 224 and review what you're going to know for your quiz. smart people who want to get a good grade, jot these things down, but we'll just see how you do. You're going to have a quiz. You're going to need to know that the Renaissance started in the South, and it was a revival of the Roman and Greek classics. Okay. You have a memory that will remember all this without jotting it down. Is that right? Good for you. I expect an A on that quiz tomorrow. Okay, so that was the classical learning from ancient Greece and Rome. That started the Renaissance in the South. In the North, it was started by, the Southern ideas had gotten to the North, but what really fueled the North was the Reformation. Now, this is all review for you. You learned all this your sophomore year, but this is to do with England specifically. There was a great burst of learning in science and in arts. Now, when people were busy dying from the Black Death and recovering, they didn't have time to paint pictures, did they? And so the fact that the economy was stable and people were healthy, it allowed for this tremendous artistic revival with people like Sandro Botticelli and Michelangelo and Leonardo and some, just remember the names of the turtles, Donatello. Anybody remember those guys? Yeah, they were all famous Renaissance artist names. And then, of course, the global explosion of people. Now, the one who sailed for England was John Cabot. He was not English, he was Italian born, but the name Cabot is an English name, so don't ask me. But anyway, John Cabot was the one that you learned about that sailed for England. So you don't need to know Da Gama, Diaz, Magellan, all those other guys, but you need to know that that happened around this period in the 1500s. You also want to know that the English explorer went first to Canada. That's the part that England first, their explorer landed in Newfoundland. So Canada is where it started. But we know that eventually it was the English who sent many people to the colonies in America. At the beginning of the 13 colonies, they were 60% British. Okay, that changed, but that's how it started. And then there was this big problem in England that whatever ruler was ruling, and this is what you need to know about the Renaissance. It started out with whoever was ruling called the religion. And there was constant conflict. Henry VIII, England was, at that time, they were Catholic like everybody else. Henry VIII wanted to marry, but he was legally married to Catherine of Aragon, who had done nothing wrong, and the church wouldn't let him. So Henry VIII was the first one to start making changes in the church because he wanted to have his way. And then he just did what he wanted anyway. He married the girl, but then he ended up cutting her head off. I don't know how many wives, do you remember, Mrs. Barnes, how many wives he beheaded? The first one he sent to Spain, he beheaded Anne Boleyn. Jane Seymour died naturally. 2? Yeah. Anyway, I wouldn't want to be his wife and look at somebody the wrong way. So he was the famous Henry VIII. And when he died, there was a short reign of his son Edward, and the poor boy died at age 15. And then there was a short reign, 5 years, of Bloody Mary, and she tried to make England Catholic again. And that was a mess. So Bloody Mary, if I ask you what religion Bloody Mary supported, what are you going to say? Catholic. Catholic, okay. And then after she died, and she died of natural causes, she wasn't murdered, Elizabeth was finally brought to the throne. And what religion did she decide on? Church of England. She just brought the ideas together and developed this Church of England, which was brilliant, something that her father had sort of started in a way. And her problem, she had one Catholic problem left. What was the name of that Catholic problem she had left, Patrick, with the photographic memory?
I don't remember.
Okay, anybody remember? Do you have your book?
Not today.
Oh, bummer. You need to look with someone because seeing it really helps. Yes? The question is, after Elizabeth became queen, she had one big problem, one big Catholic problem. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, who was eventually executed. Now, she was kept alive for a long time, but the Parliament finally insisted that she was executed because she kept raising people to attack Elizabeth. All right, high fashion we talked about. You should know what a farthingale is. Can anyone tell me what a farthingale is? Yes?
It's the wire thing that makes this skirt look like a bell.
Yes, crazy, huh? But it was stretched over thick iron wire. Iron. You know, it wouldn't have been so bad if it was made of aluminum, but iron? Terrible, yes.
I watched this video on like fashion from around the world, and they talked about the farthingale, and they said that like the bigger it was or the wider it was like you were more fancy because it meant you didn't have to do anything. And there was one that was literally like so long.
Oh my gosh. It's crazy. And the pressure of that must have gone on your waist, but of course you were corseted to, you know, and that's so bad for your breathing. They'd pull that corset until you were this big. So crazy fashion. What did the guys wear around their neck? What was that called? A ruff, and I think it would have been ruff, R-U-F-F. And then when Elizabeth died, what house took over the throne? The Stuarts. And James the First had been James the Fourth of Scotland. He was from Scotland. He took the throne. Did he do okay? Yeah, he did all right. People didn't get mad at him that much. He was real friendly and nice, and he sponsored the King James Bible, and he was fine. In fact, when the explorers were going out, Jamestown is named after him. So we have the King James Bible. That has to do with James the First, who followed Elizabeth, and so does Jamestown, Virginia, have to do with his name. So there's a couple things about him. He died, and he was followed by Charles the First. And what happened to poor Charlie? He was, first and only English monarch to ever be beheaded or executed. And when he was beheaded and executed, who were the people that took power? Alice, who were the people that took power when Charles was beheaded? The Puritans, and that was called the Commonwealth. Now remember, James, Charles, the Puritans. Who was the next king, James? The next king after the Puritans took control. Okay, so it went James the First, Charles the First. Then we had the Commonwealth, and where it went James, Charles here, down here it goes Charles, James, like you're seeing the reflection in the water. So we have Charles II. And he didn't want to come back at first because, why didn't he want to come back at first? Do you remember that? I was asking James, yeah, but you knew that, didn't you, James? Okay, and so then after him was James II, and that's a funny story too, that he was not popular at all, and the people decided to overthrow him, and he found out, and what did he do? He fled. I don't know, maybe he dressed up like a woman and fled the castle, but he snuck out somehow, and he got away. So it was the Glorious Revolution where William and Mary showed up. Okay, the artist that worked for the court of England. I would like you to know that. It's a famous name in art. His name is Hans, H-A-N-S, Holbein, H-O-L-B-E-I-N, Holbein, Hans Holbein. So H.H. was the court painter for H the Eighth. Okay, so Henry's court painter was H.H., Hans Holbein. So you want to connect those together. All right, now I think we've covered anything that you might need to that section. Let's go to your last page. I want you to just look at this page. This is so fun. See is how tiny the writing is, just one little skinny column. I want you to study that tonight. Richard Lederer is a man who studies words, and he has written some very humorous books on the English language, but this article is by him, and what I want you to notice is in the second section, does anyone remember how many words approximately Shakespeare invented? 1,700, you want to know that. And he made up 8.5% of our vocabulary. Well, that was a while back. I'm sure since the techno age, we've added so many technology words that that's not true anymore. But when this was written, before the technological revolution, 8.5% of our words were from Shakespeare. That's pretty impressive. And then it gives some examples of the words he wrote. I want you to look at those. Ben Jonson, we will learn about him, was a playwright who lived at the same time as Shakespeare, and he was amazing. If Shakespeare hadn't been alive, I think we'd be studying Ben Jonson as much as we study Shakespeare. But he had a stiff competitor in Shakespeare. But when Shakespeare died, Ben Jonson said he was not of an age, but for all time. And that has sure proven true because we still read Shakespeare today. We still go to his plays. We still do plays based on his plays, like She's the Man and, you know, some of those things. We do those based on Shakespeare's works. Okay, so I love this quiz down at the bottom on page 232. When I took it, I realized there were some I didn't know. Do you know these? Neither a blank or a blank B. Neither a blank or a blank B. It'll come to me. How about number 2? All the world's a... Oh, that would be nice. All the world's a stage. With bated... Yes, that's right. Break the... I know that.
Break the leg. Break the bank.
Break the bank. That's what it is. Break the bank. Come full...
Leave empty.
Try again. Come full. Circle. Right. Eat me out of house and home. A foregone conclusion. Laugh yourself into. Actually, it was stitches, and it was a weird thing for him to say, but it means to laugh so hard you can't control yourself. Do not blank an inch. Right. Too much of a good. Yeah, or thing. All right, so there you go. Some phrases from Shakespeare. Oh, the first one, neither a blank or a blank B. I knew that the first time I looked at this. Now it's not coming to neither a blank or a blank B. Do you know that one, Deborah? Neither a something or a something B.
I don't know.
I don't even think it gives the answers in here. Huh. You'd think they'd give me the answers in the... A borrower or a lender. That's it. Neither a borrower or a lender B. Yes, neither.
They're just fun.
Yeah, I just wanted to see how many you still knew in this day and age. Okay, so you know what to do for tomorrow, guys? Be prepared.